The waiter was just standing there, frozen, holding the tray like it weighed 100 pounds. You could see it on his face. This wasn't about a steak anymore. This was about power, about humiliation, about a kid realizing that one wrong moment in front of the wrong man could cost him his job, his rent, maybe his whole future. Frank was already halfway into one of those moods, the jaw tight, the eyes hard, the kind of anger that didn't burn hot and fast, but cold and sharp, the kind that made people disappear quietly afterward. Sammy stared down at his plate. Peter Lawford shifted in his seat. Nobody wanted to be part of this. Nobody ever was. Then Dean Martin took a sip of his drink. Not hurried, not dramatic, just calm, almost bored. "Frank," he said again, softer this time but firmer, "it's a steak. You didn't get shot. That did it?" Frank slammed his fork down. "You got something you want to say to me, Dean?" Dean met his eyes without flinching. No smile, no joke, no charm, just truth. "Yeah," he said, "although you're tearing into a kid who didn't do a damn thing to deserve it. That makes you wrong. And when you're wrong, I'm gonna tell you." The room went dead silent. Even the clinking of glasses stopped. Conversations at nearby tables faded. Everyone knew what they were witnessing, even if they didn't fully understand it. This wasn't dinner banter. This was someone standing up to Frank Sinatra in his own house. Frank stared at Dean like he was seeing him for the first time. "You think you're going to lecture me?" Frank said slowly. "In my restaurant." Dean shrugged. "Doesn't matter where we are. You're still acting like a bully." Sammy finally looked up, eyes wide. Peter's face had gone pale. The waiter swallowed hard, waiting for the hammer to fall. Frank leaned forward. "You know who you're talking to?" Dean didn't raise his voice, didn't lean in, didn't posture. "I know exactly who I'm talking to," he said. "My friend, and my friend is acting like an asshole." You could almost hear the oxygen leave the room. That word, nobody ever used that word on Frank. Not to his face, not ever. For a long moment, it looked like Frank might explode. His hands clenched, his face flushed. This was the moment where careers ended, friendships shattered. Phones rang the next morning with bad news. Then something unexpected happened. Frank leaned back. He looked at the kid. Really looked at him for the first time. The shaking hands, the fear, the apology that had already been said 3 times and ignored. Frank exhaled, "Get him another steak." Frank muttered, "Rare." The manager, who had appeared out of nowhere, nodded furiously and whisked the plate away. The waiter didn't move. Dean noticed. "Hey," Dean said, turning to him. Guide. You guide." The kid nodded, eyes wet. "Go on," Dean said. "You didn't ruin anyone's night. Sit down. Have a smoke when you're done. You're fine." The waiter mouthed "Thank you" and disappeared into the kitchen like he'd just been given his life back. The table stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then Frank shook his head and laughed. Not loud, not angry, a low, surprised laugh. "You're unbelievable," Frank said. "You know that?" Dean took another sip. "I've been told." Frank looked around the table. "You see this?" he said to Sammy and Peter. Nobody else in this world talks to me like that. Dean glanced over. That's because nobody else is your friend. That landed. Frank stared at his drink for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. Yeah, he said, that's probably true. When the replacement steak came, Frank didn't complain. He cucined it, took a bite, and kept eating. Dinner resumed, but something had shifted. Later that night, as they were leaving, Frank stopped Dean near the door. Just the two of them for a second. You didn't have to do that, Frank said quietly. Dean looked at him. Yeah, I did. Frank studied him, then gave a half smile. Most people let me get away with it. Dean put his hand on Frank's shoulder. That's why you keep doing it. Frank laughed under his breath. You're a pain in the ass. Yeah, Dean said. But I'm your pain in the ass. Frank squeezed his shoulder once. Don't change. Don't change. I won't, Dean said. You might want to, though. Years later, Sammy Davis Jr. would tell that story in private, never on camera. He'd say the same thing every time. People think Dean was the easy one, the drunk act, the cool guy. But when it mattered, when someone needed protecting, Dean was the strongest man in the room. He wasn't afraid of Frank. He wasn't afraid of power. He was afraid of being the kind of man who stayed quiet when someone got hurt. The waiter never forgot that night either. He stayed at Villa Capri for years, eventually became a manager himself. And whenever a customer got cruel with his staff, he shut it down immediately. When someone once asked him why he was so strict about it, he said, because I saw Dean Martin stand up to Frank Sinatra for a kid he didn't even know. And if he could do that, I can do this. That's the thing about Dean Martin. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't make speeches. He just drew a line, and he stood there calmly, while the most powerful man in the room realized he'd crossed it. Frank loved the laughter, the parties, the mythology of the Rat Pack. But Dean was the one person whose opinion actually mattered to him. Not because Dean was louder or tougher, but because Dean never wanted anything from Frank. And that made all the difference. After that night at Villa Capri, something subtle changed. Not publicly, not in interviews, but privately among the people who knew them. The shift was unmistakable. Frank still had his temper. He still exploded. He still scared people. But there were moments, rare moments, when he'd pause, when he'd catch himself, when someone would say later he was about to lose it. And then he looked over at Dean, and Dean wouldn't say a word. He wouldn't need to. The look was enough. Michael Omano, the waiter, finished his shift that night in a fog. He expected to be called into the manager's office. Expected to be fired anyway. That's how those stories usually ended. You crossed the wrong man, even by accident, and you pay for it quietly. But no one called him in. The manager clapped him on the shoulder instead and said, "You're fine. Go home." Michael didn't sleep that night. He replayed the scene over and over in his head. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, the silence, the smile. The way Dean had looked at him like he was just a human being, not collateral damage. Years later, Michael would say that moment changed how he treated people forever. "I realized something that night," he said. "Power doesn't have to be cruel, and kindness doesn't have to be weak." Dean proved that. For Frank, the moments lingered too. A few weeks later, at another restaurant, another waiter messed up an order The table went quiet. Everyone braced for impact. Frank looked at the plate, then looked up. "Just send it back," he said. "No big deal." Dean raised an eyebrow. Frank smirked. "Don't get used to it." Dean smiled into his drink. That was their rhythm. Push and pull. Fire and restraint. Frank was chaos. Dean was gravity. And that's why it worked. People loved to talk about Dean Martin as if he floated through life on charm alone. The drunk act. The ease. The cool. But what they miss is that Dean had a spine of steel. He just didn't need to show it often. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He didn't posture. He spoke once, calmly, clearly. And when he did, even Frank Sinatra listened. That's the real lesson of that night at Villa. Capri.courage doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like a man quietly setting his fork down and saying, "Enough." Dean Martin didn't humiliate Frank to look good. He didn't rescue the waiter to be a hero. He did it because bullying offended him, because cruelty bored him, because dignity mattered, and because he understood something most people never do. Real friendship isn't blind loyalty. It's honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially then. That's why Frank forgave him. That's why Frank respected him. That's why Frank needed him. Because in a world where everyone was afraid to tell Frank Sinatra the truth, Dean Martin did it over a steak. And sometimes, that's all it takes to reveal who someone really is. And that's the part people miss when they tell these stories years later. They frame them as moments of bravado, as if Dean Martin was some fearless rebel who enjoyed confrontation. That was never true. Dean didn't like conflict. He didn't like tension. He didn't like raised voices or public scenes. What he liked was decency. And when decency was violated right in front of him, especially by someone he loved, he couldn't ignore it. Dean understood something most people around Frank never did. Frank's anger wasn't strength. It was insecurity wearing a sharp suit. It was pressure leaking out sideways. Frank carried the weight of expectations, power, reputation, and a lifetime of having to prove himself. When he lashed out, it wasn't because the steak was medium or a sound level was off. It was because he felt out of control. Dean saw that, and instead of feeding it or flattering it, he grounded it. That's why Frank listened. Dean never humiliated Frank in front of others to make himself look righteous. He didn't grandstand. He didn't lecture. He didn't moralize. He simply stated the truth in plain language and refused to back down. You're being a bully. You're acting beneath yourself. Stop it. Short sentences. No drama. No fear. That calm was what disarmed Frank. Yelling back would have escalated things. Dean's quiet certainty shut them down. And Frank knew the difference. Anyone else who challenged Frank was either trying to posture or trying to provoke him. Dean wasn't doing either. Dean wasn't competing. He wasn't threatening Frank's authority. He wasn't trying to win. He was protecting someone weaker and reminding Frank who he was supposed to be. That's why it landed. It's also why Frank never retaliated. In Hollywood, there were consequences for crossing Sinatra. Careers stalled. Invitations stopped. Phones stopped ringing. But none of that ever happened to Dean. Not once. Because Frank understood something very clearly. Dean wasn't disloyal. Dean was loyal in the deepest sense. The kind of loyalty that doesn't let you become someone you'll regret. Frank once said to someone years later, half joking but completely sincere, "Dean's the only guy who could tell me I'm wrong and make me thank him for it." That wasn't a weakness. That was respect. And Dean never abused that position. He didn't correct Frank over trivial things. He didn't micromanage his behavior. He stepped in only when something crossed the line. Cruelty, humiliation, power being used to crush instead of command. Those were the moments Dean couldn't stomach. Those were the moments when silence would have made him complicit. That's what made Dean different from everyone else in the room. Power surrounds itself with silence. People learn quickly that it's safer to look away, safer to laugh along, safer to let someone else pay the price. Dean refused that bargain. He didn't see himself as above waiters, engineers, or crew members. He saw them as people. And once you see someone that way, you can't unsee it. You can't justify letting them be mistreated just to stay comfortable. That's why these stories endure. Not because Dean Martin was famous, not because Frank Sinatra was terrifying, but because everyone watching knew exactly how rare that moment was. A man with nothing to gain and plenty to lose, choosing to speak. Anyway, choosing decency over convenience, choosing character over silence. Michael Romano never forgot it. Neither did the sound engineer. Neither did the crew members who watched Frank recalibrate because Dean asked them to. Those moments ripple outward in ways fame never does. They become private reference points in people's lives. The night someone stood up. The night power paused. The night fear lost. And Frank, for all his bluster and rage, understood that on some level too. He didn't need more people telling him he was right. He needed one person willing to tell him the truth. Dean was that person. Not because he was braver than everyone else, but because he was more secure. He didn't need Frank's approval. He didn't need his protection. He didn't need his spotlight. And that made his words impossible to dismiss. That's why, in the end, their friendship lasted. Not because they always agreed, not because they always got along, but because it was honest. And honesty, especially when power is involved, is the rarest currency of all. The night Dean Martin told Frank Sinatra to shut up wasn't about a stake. It was about boundaries. It was about using influence to protect the powerless instead of intimidating them. It was about a friendship strong enough to survive truth. And that's why the story keeps being told. Because long after the music fades, long after the lights go out, long after the names become history, what people remember isn't who had the most power. It's who used it well.